Good morning, everyone. This is just going to be a short interview to give you a little bit of a taste of what a clinical and academic role might look like. I've got the pleasure of having Dr. Maria Patton join me this morning, who's going to be answering a number of questions in relation to the role. Maria, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for the invitation to sort of talk to you today. It's really nice to think how much things are moving on in research in Echo, and hopefully this will be really useful to people. So I'm a clinical academic. I'm a clinical lecturer technically at the University of Leeds and have a joint position as an honorary clinical cardiac scientist at the Leeds Teaching Hospitals Trust.
Perfect. So I think to start with, it'd be really nice to hear a little bit about your career journey and how it ended up that you had this type of joint clinical and academic role.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've listened to lots of people's sort of journeys through clinical academia in the past, and it's something that we share a lot across all of the clinical academics at Leeds. And hopefully, I find this the most interesting part because everybody's kind of weaved their own path into doing this as a career. So mine it feels quite strategic, I think, actually, because I'm kind of the first of a pathway through the NIHR sort of fellowship. So I remember starting, it was back in 2016. I was accredited in Echo and was part of the heart failure clinic, which was somewhere in Leeds where research was really thriving. Everybody in the team was involved in delivering some kind of research opportunity, and there was a hub for research at the time. The new sort of BMP criteria had come out, and everybody was quite excited. We were seeing lots and lots of patients, but we really knew we needed to tailor this quite a lot. So there was a lot of research activity going on in that team. And also, I'd maybe gotten to the point where I felt a little bit like I was in a conveyor belt in clinical practice already, and I just wanted to try and change that a little bit and add different aspects of my career into the mix. And I'd always been quite academic and really enjoyed that part of it. So I took a role being a research physiologist delivering a clinical trial that one of the consultants here had started and had got funding for. And so to begin with, that was a fixed term contract for a year, and it was to lead and run a multi-centre trial in the region. So that was like my first taste of research, and I was definitely thrown in at the deep end, but very quickly realized that I absolutely loved it. And it gave me sort of that flexibility to see patients the whole way through their journey. And also, I still felt really integrated into the heart failure team. And then this opportunity came up with the NIHR, and they had devised some internships, which were like 30 days of just connecting with other people that were interested in research and giving you little tasters of what a research career might look like. And that was in what was then the integrated clinical academic pathway. So I applied for one of those and got it, and that gave me a bit of funding to be self-funded for a period of time. I used that to then apply for a pilot award here at the trust, and that was funded through a charitable foundation associated with the trust, and that was to buy my time out for a year to prepare a big scale fellowship application. And the trusts and the universities are graded on supporting these. So there should be lots of them in everybody's area. But really, it takes that long to put together one of these big fellowships, especially at the beginning when you're starting out and you need to sort of connect yourself with all the different people that might be involved. So that's what I did, and started to get some pilot data on the work that I was really interested in, which at the time was optimizing device therapy for heart failure. And that's still true today. And then I built up my doctoral fellowship application. So that was with the NIHR. That was again in the ICA pathway, which is the integrated clinical academic pathway. So that's specifically for people who are from a non-medical background who want to have a clinical academic career. And was fortunate enough to get on that. So moved on to my PhD full time. I managed to finish that in 2020. In the midst of lockdown, I was writing away, and then and also applied for my clinical lectureships. That's my first postdoc position, to try and have a seamless interaction. So so to absolutely miss out on having any period where I wasn't funded, which obviously can be a bit difficult. And at that point, I'd already gone back into practice 50% of the time as well. So I was sort of running my fellowship at 50-50 and was on maternity. I managed to get that on my maternity. So when I came back from maternity, I started my clinical lectureship. So I'm just over halfway through that now, and I've got 1 year left and starting to think about my next fellowship.
Fantastic. So I think to a lot of people who might be listening to this, they may not understand what a clinical fellowship actually means. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. And it isn't a really straightforward answer because there's such a spectrum now, and people are really encouraged to stay in clinical practice if what you want to do is clinical research. So at the beginning, when I started, it was really advocated that, especially when you do your doctoral fellowship, you tend to be a clinical specialist in an area, you tend to be accredited. And for most of these fellowships, you have to have things like HCPC registration, so you're at least STP level. And so you kind of encouraged to go straight into research and try and do that full time for a few years at your doctoral fellowship level. And by the end of that, you want to be merging that back in with some clinical practice, which is kind of what I did. And often people would like you to work 50-50 so that you have a clinical element to your career and also a research element. And those two things inevitably become quite entwined because you tend to end up being a specialist in your area of research, which tends to lead into a clinical area as well. But they can be completely different. You can go through a very academic route. One of my colleagues, John Garula, does clinical research, but his is a full-time academic position. So he doesn't necessarily have a leadership role or any role within the trust, although all of his work is very much based on patients. And then obviously you can go completely the other way and also go fully into academic practice and think about things like basic science, which is all about lab work and looking at cells. And a few people I know have also done that. So there can be a whole spectrum, and you can kind of devise your fellowship now around what percentage of clinical work you'd like to keep and what area of specialist research work you'd like to have as well.
Perfect. So it sounds like it's very bespoke and very individualized, which means that you can build something that's very specific to you and you get a lot of enjoyment out of that. You mentioned that you did your doctorate. What was your subject area? Was it devices and heart failure?
Yeah, so most of my doctoral work and a lot of it still is around Brady device patients, mainly because they're quite an underserved population, to be honest. We tend to implant these pacemakers in bulk and not really maybe consider the consequences. Obviously, there's a lot more going on now around conduction system pacing, but these were a group of patients that are quite a huge work burden to us and a massive cohort, and it was how we could optimize device programming to help these patients, whether we can avoid patients from developing heart failure based on the way that we can program their devices, and also thinking about the risk stratification before a device. So how can we, and I particularly use echo obviously, how can we use echo and more of sort of the novel advanced measurements that we can get our hands on now to try to tailor device prescription for patients in the future. And I'm dual specialty, so that's a particular interest sort of and a gap, I think, because actually most people tend to be in one area. So that's kind of what I could offer. And I was really lucky because that was my interest. And also there was a group at Leeds here that were also doing similar work. So it was really handy for me to align with them. And I think that is one of the really important things about research, and maybe less so about location now. There's a lot more ways that we understand how we can link up with people. You know, we're using digital technology a lot more, and having sort of supervision from afar can absolutely work really well. So there might be a team that you can locate even nationally or internationally that you could align with if they sort of suit your interest. And let's be honest, you're going to be doing a PhD for 4 years. So you want to make sure that you are really interested and sort of devoted to the subject, because otherwise it feels like a little bit of a slog getting through it.
100%. And, you know, I really admire that you're a specialist in both of those areas. That's quite complex. You know, your brain has to be double the size of everybody else's. So leading on a research project, on your own seems something that's quite daunting to people. So did you ever feel like you didn't know what you were doing?
Absolutely. In hindsight, I would say I probably wasn't ready to lead a multi-center clinical randomized trial from the offset, which was the first job that I kind of took in research. And I definitely was a little bit out of my depth, but it was a really steep learning curve. I think, especially now as well, even throughout my career, there's been a huge change in the way that research is integrated into everybody's professional practice. And that you will often find, because it is really important for trusts and universities to be supporting people, and it's something that they're sort of assessed on, then you will find lots of programs and training available for people to tap into, a lot more than was ever there when I started out on my career, and that was only in 2017. So things have really progressed, but you can find a lot on the NIHR website. There's a lot of sort of e-learning on there, and also your trust. Just get in touch with your R&I departments, and like I say, they usually have some kind of training program that you can tap into. And there's a lot of work in the area around like pre-doctoral sort of fellowships. So there's a fellowship called the PCAF, which is the Preclinical Academic Fellowship. So you go for that, and that's sort of master's level education to try and arm you with some of these research skills, so that actually, because even at your doctoral fellowship level, you're still very much considered to be a supervised researcher. But this just gives you a good foundation. I did a master's in health research at the University of Leeds as part of my internship, and that kind of fed into the beginning of my doctoral fellowship. But I would say the bar is getting raised every year, because obviously there's more and more of these opportunities available to people. So there's more people that apply for fellowships that already have some research training. So it's definitely something that I would look into as early as you have interest.
Yeah, I think that's a really good tip. And you mentioned that you had a lot of support around you. How do you build a research team like that? How do you know who to engage with and how to get the right support?
Yeah, I think so. We often focus a lot on the 3 Ps around any fellowship. So this is the person, so that's yourself, and obviously you can get yourself ready and look at your CV and what training needs you have. There's the place, and that's equally as important. Funders and people who will support you on your fellowship will look at where you are aligned with the host institute, whether that be a trust or a higher academic institute, and they will look at their track record, and not just their track record of PhDs and funding, but also their success in supporting people who are non-medical professionals in having a career like this. So it's really important to consider the institute that you're aligning with, because that will inherently decide who you have as in terms of support around you. And then there's also thinking of the team. So you want to make sure that you have an academic supervisor who's going to help you through your PhD and your research and be able to guide you, but also more of a clinical supervisor who's going to understand maybe more of the clinical research and that specialist clinical area that you're working in. And also what I really benefited from, and I wasn't really bought into this at the beginning, I have to say, is that I got a mentor through my NIHR fellowship, and they sort of arranged that for me. So it was somebody that I didn't know, wasn't really involved in my area, but was a non-medical researcher professor, and she has been incredible. It's so useful to have somebody who is, I think, both outside of your profession and outside of your team, so that you can just have these really honest conversations about where you're struggling, or where you think the challenges are, and what you can do in the future, and just kind of empower you to keep going, because you do build a lot of resilience when you're working through research, and I think having any means of support that you can to sort of align with is really useful. And to be honest, the best support I've had is from the people who also, people think, oh, you have to get all these professors on board on the research team, but sometimes it's the people who have just gone through some of these programs, who really have like current knowledge in what the fellowship sort of space looks like, or what the different options are and which ones might suit you. And also they've just been through the application process, so they really well remember sort of all of the daunting aspects, but tips and tricks that might help you as well, and how much support you need. So maybe just also try and align with someone who's a bit more like a peer.
I 100% agree with that. I think that was one of the most useful tips for me as well when I was going through my research. And I think that also we can't underestimate the value of the research team, just in terms of understanding that pathway, helping you through applications, making sure that you engage with the patient population as well, and, you know, get their input. It's just, you know, we rely so much on our immediate team, but it's also the wider team that just provides so much support. So we know where you're at in your career now, but where do you go from here?
So, interesting question. As I kind of touched upon, I mean, I always remember the professor of our team is very driven, and I remember getting my doctoral fellowship, and I think the minute I told him I got it, he said, "Right, what's the next thing?" And it is a little bit like that in research. I think people were mad when I first thought I would go on to like a temporary contract, essentially, and that is pretty much the reality of working in research, is that you have a contract for as long as your fellowship is, and it's up to you to bring in more funding. And so you are always thinking that next step ahead, and where can I go? Because, like we said, an application does take the best part of the year to pull together. So I'm already thinking about my fellowship application, which has to go in next year, to make sure I don't have a gap without any funding. And there are lots of schemes. So I think maybe I'm making this sound quite daunting, but there's always pockets of funding around. So there are always lots of things to access. And if you work up one of these big fellowship applications, you can kind of mold that into lots of different applications, so that you know that you're applying for about 3 or 4 and giving yourself a better chance of getting one. But I'm thinking about now, I had a bit of a debate whether to continue down the true clinical academic pathway of the NIHR, which is this kind of integrated pathway. That really works for me because I have really entwined my clinical and my research practice. But I know, kind of as time goes on, a lot more researchers tend to move more into an academic fellowship, which means that you don't have any sort of strict requirement to do any clinical practice, and that's just because they've become so interested in the research that they kind of don't feel the need to work in clinical practice anymore. And there's also a really high amount of people after their doctoral fellowship that just go back into clinical practice full time. And there's a lot of support now from the NIHR to try and get people back into research, even if they just want to do a small bit, like a day a week or half a day a week. So there are lots of different schemes, like we said, to sort of tailor what you want to do. But for me, absolutely, it's going to be going on to my next fellowship, which will be my senior clinical lectureship. I'm hoping to do that, I think probably 50-50 again, although the reality is that it is really difficult to continue essentially what is 2 jobs within a part-time role. And again, you can sort of sway that number a little bit. And at that level, I'll kind of be at associate professor level within the university, but these things don't just happen. There's a lot of negotiation in contracts in the background, and me trying to prove how valuable I am to the university and the trust. So there's a lot of work to do, and a lot of sales pitches in the next year to make sure that I have somewhere to go.
Yeah, of course. I think that all those institutions that you've aligned with will definitely be able to see the value in your work so far. So to finish with, what are the top tips that you might be able to offer to those who are listening, who might be wanting to start a career in relation to both combined clinical and academic work?
I think the best thing to do is to just build up a little bit of experience. So start reaching out to people who are clinicians who are involved in research, and seeing where you can align. Think about putting things like abstracts in to gain a little bit of experience that way, and also tap into any of the training programs that you can in your sort of local area. We have, essentially, the trust here has built their own preclinical fellowship pathway. So there's a whole host of things that you can usually tap into. If you're struggling for any reason, please just reach out, because you'd be surprised. It does feel like another world, but once you're in it, you kind of realize there's this whole host of opportunities. But sometimes, like anything, it's just about being involved, like being integrated, and sort of being able to navigate that. And so many people are out there who will absolutely find the time to help you, me being one of them. So if there's any issue at all, or anything that you're interested in, please do reach out. And as part of the Research and Audit Committee for the BSE, we are more than happy to help support people.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Maria. It's been lovely talking to you. And I hope that those who listen to this get a bit of a feel for the type of role that you have and how interesting it can be. As Maria said, reach out if you've got any questions, and we're more than happy to try and support. Thanks all for listening.